So hello again, this is part 2 of our videos about the Barry family and a great Norman dynasty who landed in Ireland in 1169 with the first wave of invaders and conquered a fairly significant estate in Cork. Last time we heard we had the Normans had arrived in Wexford in the extreme southeast of Ireland and had conquered quite widely. They conquered Dublin in 1170, and by 1177 Robert FitzStephen and his nephew Robert de Barry, along with a number of other Norman knights, had been granted this kingdom of Cork, Viking, or the descendants of Hiberno-Norse kingdom in the extreme southwest of Ireland around the famous city of Cork. Robert FitzStephen with his nephew Robert de Barry had been granted this little eastern portion between the Blackwater and the Lee on the eastern side of Cork City. And the Barry family by 1200 had been granted some of the most important estates, some of the most important lands in this kingdom of Cork. Buttevant up in the north of North Cork, Castle Lyons, one of the original grants, and later Barry's Court, which was a later estate that they were given. What we know is that by 1200 the grandson of, the nephew of Robert de Barry, William de Barry, was in control of this estate. Robert had died without any children in around 1183 and been succeeded by his younger brother Philip, and by 1200 William de Barry was in control of this estate. So what we're going to hear today is a bit about the descendants of William de Barry and the Barrymore, the Barryroe, and the Barrys of all types. This famous family who went into battle with the battle cry, "Bougez en avant," strike forward. So we talked a little bit about how the Barrys arrived in Ireland. They arrived as part of the Norman invasion of Ireland, and I'd just like to draw your attention to 3 books that I've written. They're published through Accent Press, or Headline Accent Press. They are called the SWORDLAND, Lord of the Sea Castle, and the EarlStrongbow, and they are a historical fiction account of the Norman invasion of Ireland. Robert de Barry, the first Barry to arrive in Ireland, he arrives in SWORDLAND, and his brother Philip de Barry, a young man at the time, comes on the scene in the EarlStrongbow, and I think you'll see some familiar names in there. Robert FitzStephen, who was granted the East Cork, Milo de Coogan and Raymond Fitzgerald, or Raymond de Carew, come into play in these 2 books as well. So they're a good read, hopefully quite exciting, and charts the history of the Barrys and how they arrived in Ireland. So if you are a Barry or you've got Barry blood, check out these and see if you see what you think. Cheers. So by 1200 we have reached down the family tree. This is Robert, the original Barry in Ireland, his younger brother Philip. And this is William de Barry, who was made Lord of Olethan and Orrery in Cork. He had held lots of land down there as one of the closest relatives to the Lord of Cork. The original grantees of Cork are actually closely similar. This is Princess Nest, from whom all these people are descended. Her first husband was Gerald de Windsor, and that's from whom the Barrys are descended, as well as the Fitzgeralds of Kildare and Desmond. Remember the name, the Desmonds. And there's the de Carew family. And over here we have Milo de Coogan, who was granted West Cork in 1177, and Robert FitzStephen, his uncle, who was married, or his cousin, excuse me, who was granted East Cork. It was Robert who granted East Cork to Raymond de Carew, and who later enfiefed, is that the right word? Certainly granted lands to Robert de Barry and his brother Philip. So by 1200 we have Barrys in Ireland, and sitting pretty with lots and lots of castles. They still had to fight for them, and they would continue to for several hundred years. William's son was David de Barry, and his son was another David de Barry. Unfortunately, there's a lot of David de Barrys in this story. And he died in 1261 at the Battle of Callan alongside the father of the Earls of Desmond, the Fitzgerald family. And the Barry and Fitzgerald family, the Desmond Fitzgerald family, would combine forces for many centuries as close relatives, allies, and they would intermarry at different periods as well. So in 1261 we have David de Barry dying in battle. His son, David Oge, David the Younger, was obviously a very well respected warrior and administrator, and he became Justiciar of Ireland, basically the governor of Ireland in the 1270s, and as a result of doing his job pretty well, seems pretty well, Justiciar, David Oge was created Baron or Lord Barry. So he was the first one to be ennobled as we now know it. His family held vast lands in Cork, but he was the first one to be ennobled in the 1270s. The family, of course, would continue to, have sons, and they would go off and have little estates of their own. And through over the next couple of centuries, this family would split into several bits. Now, people may have heard the phrase "more Irish than the Irish themselves," and this was a phrase that sort of points to the gradual hibernicization, if that's even a word, of the Barrys and the other Norman families who arrived. Fitzgeralds, Burke, Butler even, we all went through periods of becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves, as the saying goes. And the Barrys, when they split into various Gaelicized, hibernicized portions, took names to identify them. So the head of the family, the Baron Barry, the Lord Barry, his branch of the family were called Barrymore, the Big Barry, the Chief Barry, and that was a name that they held as a sort of Gaelic prince, was the Barrymore. There were other branches of the family. There was a couple, I think Barry Whale, the Bald Barry, not pleasant, Barry Ladier, the Strong Barry, and the other one that we need to keep track of is the Barryroe, the Barryroe, which is my name as well, the Red Barry, Barryroe we'll call him. And they settled in lands down close to Fota Island at the Carrick-Tuile, and their castle was called Barry's Court, and that's still, it's now a hotel I believe, but that was their principal fortress. The Barrymore maintained Buttevant, of which we've heard, and Castle Lyons, northern and eastern Cork, whereas the Barryroe was at Barry's Court. So the Lords Barry, they continued to prosper, and they were later made Viscount Buttevant. Viscount is a higher rank of the peerage than the Baron, so they went from Baron Barry to being Viscount Buttevant, which is great for them. But their power was beginning to wane, and the Barryroe down in Barry's Court was a chap called James Barry, James Barry, and he wanted to be recognised as the head of the Barry family. So he had married into the Roaches, another hibernicized Norman family, and somewhere along the line made an alliance with the McCarthys, the McCarthy Ray, another hugely powerful Munster family. And in 1557, James Barryroe murdered Viscount Buttevant, the Barrymore. He may not have murdered him. Certainly Barrymore died, and James Barryroe claimed the titles both in the English peerage and the Irish nobility. So he claimed to be no longer just Barryroe, but to be Barrymore, and to be the Viscount Buttevant as well. So we have this assumption of the title of Viscount Buttevant, and the merging of the Barryroe and the Barrymore to make an even more powerful head of the family, which I can only presume did not meet well with the government up in Dublin. I presume that quite scared them as well. So James Barryroe, who became Barrymore in 1557 and Viscount Buttevant, this is an extremely tumultuous time in Ireland and England, in fairness. King Henry VIII has only died about a decade before, and he had started this idea of trying to reconquer Ireland. Ireland over the previous couple of centuries had been a very anarchic place, and had basically most of the major lords, if they did take orders from Dublin or London, they did it when and if they wished to. So the royal crown in England wanted to re-establish control over Ireland, and they did this in numerous ways. Throw into that this is a time of great upheaval in the church. Henry VIII split the Church of England into away from the papal Rome in the 1520s or 30s, excuse me, and we have an extremely tumultuous time. Most of the descendants of the Norman invaders, like the Barry family, had remained Catholic and had become more Irish than the Irish themselves. They were also extremely independent. They thought of themselves as princes of their own lands, and they weren't going to tip their cap to anybody unless they had to. So we have a clash of cultures, religions, and independent powers. And in 1570, the local magnate, the Earl of Desmond, descendant of those original invaders himself, rose in rebellion, and of course the Barrys, being amongst their most loyal retainers and sublords, rose with them. And James Barryroe, who was now by 1570 Viscount Buttevant, or he was calling himself Viscount Buttevant and was certainly Barrymore, he threw his support behind the Earls of Desmond, and it was attainted by the government in Dublin. We have this rebellion going on in Munster, and it would prove to be colossal. It was a real watershed moment for the southeast of Ireland, southwest of Ireland, and the Barrys were at the very forefront. Bute en avant, I'm sure, was shouted numerous times in that period. It's guessed or estimated that at least 300,000 people, and not a huge population, were killed or displaced by this rebellion by the Earls of Desmond, or the family of the Earls of Desmond and the Barrys. And in the end, in 1583, some of the Barry lands were granted away because they'd been attainted. All of the Fitzgerald family were ruined by this rebellion, and the lands of the the Viscount Buttevant were granted to English adventurers as kind of payment for having taken part in fighting this rebellion on behalf of the crown. Some of them went to a famous poet called Sir Edmund Spenser, and some went to the famous English seaman Sir Walter Raleigh, who had not been very kind to the Irish during his time in Ireland, but that's a story for another day. The Barrys managed to hold on to some of their estates. Now, this possibly because of it was easier just to hand it back to these guys who wouldn't cause more outbreak of fighting, or more likely, one of the daughters of the family had married to the Earl of Ormond, a great enemy of the Desmond family, and who had supported the royal cause during the war. So it might be in his efforts to help the Barrys that led to them hanging on to some of their family lands. By the 1580s, the head of the family was David Barry, 5th Viscount Buttevant, and he had obviously managed to hang on to some of his lands. He was predeceased by his eldest son, the Honourable David Barry, but this younger Barry, David Barry, had his wife was pregnant when he died, and she gave birth to a son who was another David Barry, just to make things complicated, who would become the 6th Viscount. The 6th Viscount succeeded his grandfather in 1617, and the 6th Viscount David, he would prove to be very important to the family. He married extremely well. I presume he had converted to the new religion, the Anglican religion, because he married the daughter of Richard Boyle, 1st Earl of Cork, this fabulously wealthy, extremely influential noble who had come over to Ireland during the latter half of the 16th century. This proved to be very important for the family, and with this help of Lord Cork, the Earl of Cork, David was again elevated from Viscount Buttevant to the next rank of the nobility, the peerage, he became Earl of Barrymore in 1628, and the man who gave him that title, or elevated him to that title, was King Charles I. Now, it may be a result of this or his alliance with the Boyle family, the Earls of Cork, that took the first Earl of Barrymore, David Barry, led him to become to declare for the Royalist side when the Wars of the Three Kingdoms broke out in 1640s. In Ireland, it's known as the Irish Confederate Wars. In England, these are the English Civil War. In Scotland, the Bishops' Wars, I suppose. But in Ireland, they were fought largely along the lines of Royalist versus Catholic Confederate. Since the 1540s, as we'd heard, Roman Catholics had been trying to fight for their rights to be recognised by the Dublin government, and in 1640s this had come to a head because of land confiscations and colonisations and plantations, and they had risen in rebellion against the crown and tried to take Dublin. What had happened was that they had taken most of the land of Ireland, other than Dublin, which was ruled by James Butler. He would later become Duke of Ormond. Galway, I think, which was under the Earl of Marquess of Clonrickard, and Cork, which was generally under the rule of the Royalist Baron Inchkin, Murragh O'Brien. Murragh O'Brien's main allies in this fight were the Boyle family, led by the Earl of Cork, and David Barry, the Earl of Barrymore, who, as we've heard, had thrown his lot in with the Royalist cause. And in 1642, the Royalists fought a major engagement against the Confederates at the Battle of Liscarroll, and David Barry, the first Earl of Barrymore, was wounded in that fight and subsequently died and was succeeded by his eldest son. Just as an indication of how confused things were, in that Battle of Liscarroll, where the first Earl of Barrymore, the head of the Barry family, died, the opposing force, who were defeated as it goes, was led by one of his distant kinsmen, a guy called Garrett Barry, who had been a professional soldier on the continent before coming to Ireland to join the Catholic Confederacy. So it just shows how difficult these things were in those days. The second Earl was David's son, and his career saw him fall back on certainly after the monarchy was re-established in 1660s. He became a leading nobleman in Ireland, allied to the Tory cause, the fledgling Tory cause, which was headed by the Duke of Ormond. He actually chose to support King James II in 1689. King James had been given the old heave-ho from England by the Glorious Revolution and the invasion of William of Orange that year. In 1689, James had arrived back in Ireland and had pretty much widespread support from most of the people in the island, and was of course declared king. And he held a parliament in 1689, and the second Earl of Barrymore actually sat in that parliament as a noble, with with support of the Stuart cause and the Jacobite cause, I should say. William of Orange quickly followed James to Ireland. He couldn't allow James to declare Ireland largely as an independent nation. So William of Orange landed in Ulster and then came down, and they fought a major engagement at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, after which James fled. The Barry family had once again managed to hang on to their power because the eldest son of the second Earl, Lawrence, he had actually thrown his support behind the other side. He had opposed King James II and had supported William of Orange. So by the time William of Orange emerged from this war as the victor, the Barrymore family had been on the right side. His younger brother and eventual successor, who became third Earl of Barrymore in 1699, was on the other side of the coin. He had been a supporter of James Stuart, James II. So again, we find Barrys on both sides at the forefront of the battle. We've got Barrys falling at Liscarroll in 1642. We've got them at the head of the declaring the support for both sides of this major war in the 1690s. And once again, the third Earl, Richard, was a soldier leading from the front. He became a really advanced. I think he ended as a major general or lieutenant general during the War of the Spanish Succession, which was the major war of Queen Anne's reign and included the battles of Blenheim and the Duke of Marlborough. And he seems to have been an extremely high-ranking officer. By 1715 or 1714, excuse me, Queen Anne dies, and there is a dispute between the Tories, who support the resumption of the Stuart monarchy, the son of King James II, coming back to the throne, and on the other side the Whigs, who want Georg of the Elector of Hanover to come to the throne. And unfortunately for the Barry family, the Whig faction win. He had supported the Stuarts coming back, and the Georg of Hanover becomes King James or King George I in 1714, and he is not happy with people who wanted to bring back the Stuarts, who mostly sort of group around the Tory faction at court, and amongst them is the Earl of Barrymore. So he is, I think he's arrested in 1715 when there's a Jacobite rebellion in Scotland, and certainly in 1740s when another Jacobite rebellion under Bonnie Prince Charlie breaks out. And but he manages to hold on to power, principally I think because of his age. By the 1740s he is well into his 70s, and I don't think he was ever going to be a principal amongst the rebels. So we're now in the 1740s in the story of the Barry dynasty, and unfortunately we have two generations where the head of the family, the Earl of Barrymore, dies very young. The fifth Earl of Barrymore, James, died when he was just in his mid-30s, and his successor died, I think, when he was in his 26. I think he was dead, and so extremely difficult circumstances for any family to keep going after those two great losses. Luckily, the sixth Earl was father to 4 children before he left this mortal coil, and he probably thought, even at dying at a young age, that the future of the Barrymore family was very much secure, because he had 3 sons ready to follow him and who would presumably go on to have advantageous marriages. The family was incredibly wealthy, even for the day. They still held major estates across County Cork, and he probably thought he had left this family in extremely good circumstances. Unfortunately, that was not the case, as we shall hear. So the children of the 6th Earl of Barrymore, they would go down in history as some of the worst behaved noblemen of the age. So the 7th Earl of Barrymore, Richard, had grown up with no father, with no grandfather, both of whom had died young. I presume that he had this colossal wealth ready for him to turn 18. His mother, I don't know if there was influence there, but something went wrong with these 4 children of the 6th Earl of Barrymore. As I say, Richard, the eldest, was known as the rake of rakes, and that's in a period known as being rakish behaviour. He was a womanizer, a gambler, a spendthrift. Yeah, he was a piece of work. His nickname, and I think it says it all about this guy, was Hellgate. That was the nickname of the 7th Earl of Barrymore, Hellgate. Presumably he spent most of his time in England during those days at the court of the Hanoverian court. He, oh my goodness, his antics were legendary of the day. He was a sort of jolly maker and trickster, as well as being all these other problems. He tried to ride, he was bred horses and wanted to ride them himself to no great victories. And he married a woman who I think ended up as a prostitute, possibly was a prostitute at the time, but also a great pugilist, a great fist fighter, a noted fist fighter. They had no children, and he lost most of his money, sold off all his estates for debt, to pay off his debts, and died as a young man he had been forced to join the army, and he died as a young man of an accidental gunshot wound when he was transporting prisoners. So his estate went to his younger brother, who was little better than his elder brother. He was nicknamed Cripplegate, I presume because of some sort of disability that he had, but he was of the same ilk of rake of rakes. Their sister, Lady Caroline, was little better than her two brothers. She was called Billingsgate after a sort of a prison, I think it was in England or in London, and that was because of she was legendary for her use of bad language. And the youngest brother, who was actually a member of the clergy, was called Augustus, and his nickname was Newgate after another prison in England. I think this sort of says it all about this family. Unfortunately, there was, by the time of the 8th Earl came into his inheritance, there was no inheritance. Most of the land had been sold off or had been frittered away to pay debts by their elder brothers. And I think the last of the family died in 1823, and that was the end of the Lords Barry, the Viscounts Buttevant and Barrymore and Barryroe, and the Earls of Barrymore. There was a short-lived barony called the Baron Barrymore, created in 1902 for a descendant of the 4th Earl, but of an illegitimate line. But that was the end of that family, and this great family that led from the front through so many wars and so many battles. This great family who stuck their neck out when other people would have hidden away. They had come to an end, probably of the same impulse of leading the charge. Was this family who had so much spirit and so much fire in them that they wanted to burn it all down. But no more would they hear the shout of "Bute en avant" on the fields of Ireland. That being said, of course, there were junior branches and cadet branches of the family had been founded. We still have many Barrys found all over the world. Every country probably has a Barry in them, and some of them have come to become household names in their fields. Charles Barry was an architect in London, and it was he who designed the Houses of Parliament, the Palace of Westminster, where the British Parliament now sits, very famously. I support Aston Villa. There was a great footballer in that team during the late 2000s called Gareth Barry. He still holds the record for being the most capped player, most games played in the Premier League. We also have Kevin Barry, a noted a sort of Republican freedom fighter from Cork, who was executed at the age of 18. And his namesake, Kevin Barry, a writer of great distinction who you should all check out. And another Barry, Sebastian Barry, probably the best known Barry of the day, who is a great writer, and he wrote Days Without End is a great book if you check that one out. And so it's only left to say, if you're a Barry, please have a comment. What notable ancestors do you have? Do you have an ancestor from the Barry family? And please like, subscribe and share where you can this video to all your Barry friends. And other than that, I'll have to say, Bute en avant, good advice, strike forward.